Pleased to say, being joined by Shea, who is just literally hot off the stage from giving his keynote, so thank you for taking that time out to come talk to
Pleasure.
us. Jamie is NATO's Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges and is a obviously acknowledged renowned expert in crisis management and communication around that. So maybe just a couple of words about what your day job is and where that takes you in emerging security.
Yep. Well, my job at NATO is to take forward NATO's policy work and also concrete actions on all of the threats that don't come in the traditional shape that we've been used to for so many centuries of tanks and army divisions and aircraft and artillery, but which really come in the more modern form of cyber attacks, terrorist threats, threats to critical infrastructure, electricity grids, chemical, biological, radiological agents, for example, in the hands of terrorists, the sort of things that we now call the homeland security type of threats. But they're also increasingly turning up in warfare. For example, every conflict these days has a cyber dimension to it. So my job is to try to make sure that NATO analyses the threats correctly and equips itself more and more to be able to operate in this kind of environment.
Yeah, and I guess thinking between, I guess you do a lot of government-led national security type stuff. Thinking about that across to where risk managers, the audience here, would see it, are there any kind of universal principles that come out about how to manage that crisis?
Well, yes, I think the principles of crisis management are pretty standard, whether you're a big company or whether you're in the private sector. And I would also say, by the way, that when we deal with the challenges that I'm dealing with, the private sector is a real player. For example, 90% of the cyber networks, as you well know, are in the hands of private companies, and we at NATO can't manage a cyber attack without calling in a telecoms company or people like Symantec or McAfee who can help us with malware analysis. And it's the same in terrorism, where you obviously also have to reach out to a lot of private sector companies for the capabilities. For example, they're the people who build the robots that go looking for the bombs under cars and so on. So I think in my area there is a much more natural alliance between private sector and government than maybe, as I said, in tanks or missiles or aircraft. That's the first thing. The second thing I would say is that when it comes to crisis management, the principles of anticipating and recognizing it early on, not being taken by surprise, how you design a reaction to that crisis, how you deal with the media, for example. Those are the sort of things where we can learn from each other, frankly. I mean, at NATO we look at, for example, cyber attacks against banks and how they manage their crisis, thinking, well, the banks have probably experienced far worse cyber attacks than we have, for obvious reasons. That's where the money is, right? Much more attractive for cyber criminals than an organisation like NATO. So clearly, if we're thinking how do we deal with a cyber crisis, we go and talk to the banks. What happened to you? How did you manage it? Because they started ahead of us. We even now, by the way, have private sector involved in our cyber defence exercises, where based on their experience, they help us write the scripts and scenarios. So I think that we can learn a lot from the private sector, and hopefully some of our experiences in the more geopolitical area, dealing with fake news, dealing with troll farms, with people faking identities online, with also people trying to knock you offline. Because the one thing in a crisis that you don't want to happen to you is that you can't communicate because you've been knocked offline through a cyber attack. So some of the experiences that we're now having in the military field, I think are of interest to private sector managers too.
Sorry, just kind of rounding off that last point actually, as the world moves to digital first, do you see some pitfalls within businesses that they're not kind of shaping and adapting their thinking quick enough, and are they agile enough to see that change and that different perspective coming through?
Well, I think that one of the big issues is that the digitalisation means that people who are against you have much more powerful weapons. They have anonymity, so they can denigrate you because they know that they're not going to be revealed in public. They're not going to be named and shamed. As I've said, they can create fictitious websites. They can pretend to be you. Impersonating people online is becoming increasingly difficult. They can throw up lots of smoke which obscures your narrative from getting through. And although we in government are facing these things, because obviously we have adversaries like big state actors who, like Russia, spend $400 million dollars a year on propaganda TV, RT. So although we're up against these actors, I can imagine that a big bank or a big company in a crisis would suddenly find that a lot of private citizens or patriotic activists would go after it and try to sort of denigrate it or falsify things and make life difficult. So what I'm trying to get across is, don't just concentrate on thinking, how do I get my own message out and what should that message be? Recognise that it's like football. There are two teams on the pitch here, and as much as you're thinking about how do I get to the goal at the other end, you've got somebody thinking about your vulnerabilities and your weaknesses and how do they get round you and score more goals. It's very dynamic these days, because I think what digitisation has done is it makes it much easier for everybody to get into the game. I mean, when I started this business, back in the 1980s, if you wanted to sort of damage somebody, you had to be a state with big research establishments, big military budgets, thousands of people working on something. But now, a simple hacktivist in a garage can bring down an air traffic control system. Anybody in the cyber age, anybody can basically attack anything, anywhere, anytime. From New Zealand. Distance doesn't mean anything. Neutrality doesn't mean anything any longer. So, and the other thing is, when I came into the business, if you were a government, you would basically only need to really worry about defending one or two things. I'll defend that airfield, I'll defend that port, basically I'll be okay. Now, you have to defend everything. Critical infrastructure, ports, airfields, air traffic control systems, water purification systems. Even in Ukraine, they've had attacks against their financial reporting system, which has now been digitised. So, unfortunately, as we get more efficiency through digitisation, we vastly increase the attack surfaces that people can aim at. And whereas we've been successful protecting some of it, for example, we spoke about banks a moment ago, and they've made a great deal of progress, obviously, in making their systems more secure. But other areas, like particularly these SCADAs, industrial control systems on power grids, for instance, air traffic control systems, telecommunication systems, fuel control systems are still very vulnerable. And the attackers have all the time in the world to look for the next vulnerability and plan to attack it. So trying to defend, when you can attack everything all the time, trying to defend everything all the time, as you can imagine, is a real headache.
Yeah. Oh dear. On that cheery note.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jeremy. That was lovely.
Sorry that I can't.
That was
More
great.
optimistic.
Fascinating. Thank you. Thank you.
My pleasure.